Hello and welcome to Ancient Gaming, where I cover old games and show you how to play them. On September of 2019, Ted Ed published a charming and colorful video about the evolution of chess. The narrator tells the story of the fall in battle of the youngest prince of the Gupta Empire and the attempt of his brother to represent his death to their grieving mother by recreating the scene in an 8x8 squares as the paddleboard. This story is one of the various legends about the origins of the widespread classic of human gaming. Unfortunately, it is also definitely not true. Today, we're going to go back in time and gather the evidence we have in order to explore the origins of chess by the hand of its grandfather, the Indian game of Chaturanga. Chaturanga has been studied mainly in the context of the history of chess itself. And it's no wonder. If the game still draws attention nowadays, it's arguably because of its connection to modern chess as being its oldest direct ancestor. Anyone familiar with this line of research has read or at least knows the work of H.J.R. Murray, A History of Chess, published right before World War I. The origins of chess have been claimed by many countries and cultures, but Murray's 1000 pages book was the first major attempt to convey a comprehensive study about the subject. He even taught himself Arabic just for the purpose of reading chess documents. And despite having been published in 1913, it remains a mandatory read for everyone trying to unravel the mysteries of what is arguably the most influential game in the history of mankind. But of course, it has been more than 100 years since Murray's book, and many elements have been added to the equation. But some of the British author's key points have remained a constant, most accepted consensus within chess historians. One of these key points, and the one I would like to start our journey with, is the fact that the origins of chess, and particularly of the game of Chaturanga, are to be found in India. Apart from that, the origins of Chaturanga are clouded in mystery. As you probably know if you watch the channel, this is true for most games that are truly ancient. People in antiquity did not used to write the rules of the games they played, and when they did, it was usually as a side note to develop another idea. They knew and passed the rules by oral tradition, and in fact we still do this to some extent. If you like playing cards, I bet you have at some point come across a game whose name you were not familiar with, only to start playing it and realize that you actually did know how to play the game already, you just called it by a different name. And perhaps use some other minor rule variants. Take the game of President for example. Most people know how to play it, but few know that its name is actually a westernized version of the Japanese game of Daifugo that was very popular in the late 20th century and that literally means Grand Millionaire. In Spain we call this game culo, so you see that it can change a lot. Anyway, the thing is that historically, the way games were born was different from the way most games are born today. When we study the sources we have about games in antiquity, it is rarely the case that this or that game was the result of one person's invention. And when this is the case, it tends to be a romanticized account about some grand historical or mythological hero. Sophocles, for instance, tells us that dice were invented by the Greek hero Palamedes during the siege of Troy. I actually made a video about the origins of dice, by the way, you can check it somewhere around here. The truth is that we can only assume that some games were at some point invented by one or more individuals, but we can actually track the development of certain games by their similarities to other games. To the point that we can safely affirm that misconceptions and cultural barriers played a greater role in the development of games than random eventual inventors. Chaturanga is popularly known for being to chess what Daifugo is for President, but this video is not so much about the history of Western chess than about Chaturanga. And if I am telling you all this, it is because we can say the same thing about the origins of Chaturanga as for the origins of Western chess. In other words, Chaturanga most likely developed from previous simpler Indian games. But first, let's start with the name itself. What does Chaturanga mean? Chaturanga is a Sanskrit word that literally means having 4 limbs. It first appears in the Rig Veda, an ancient collection of Vedic Sanskrit hymns, and it is in fact our first major clue to the whereabouts of the origins of chess. The English word chess comes from the old French chess, which comes from the Latin plural for chessmen, scacchi, which comes from the Arabic and Persian name for the king, the Shah. If we take the name of the game in Spanish or Portuguese, ajedrez and xadrez, the resemblance is even more clear. Both words appear in older Castilian as ajedrez, and this word is simply the Arabic ash-shatrang or the shatrang. Shatrang, again, is only an Arabicized form of the Middle Persian chatrang, and this Persian word is an adaptation of the Sanskrit Chaturanga. Literature, then, is the first place we have to look at to pinpoint the origins of our game, and yet again, the journey won't be easy. The earlier Sanskrit literature of the Vedic age and of the later centuries when the Brahmanas and Sutras came into existence was almost exclusively religious and poetical. And when Sanskrit finally opened to more secular subjects that were more prone to include other topics like board games, the style was not precise enough for historians to draw definite conclusions about them. For these reasons, scholars have had to rely mainly upon the comparison of more or less obscure passages to find the clues about the origins of chess. Something relating not to just board games and board game implements, but to board games and board game implements that strike a resemblance with the chess we know today. Some words testify the existence of board games before the Christian era, which is no surprise to anybody, but they are not close enough to establish a connection with a hypothetical development of chess. The word Adidevana, present in the Atharva Veda, meant for instance simply a smooth flat surface excavated in the ground for playing dice. A dice board, if you will. And Palaka was a generic term for a game board and conveys no information as regards to shape, size or arrangement. If we want to establish a connection, we need something stronger than that. Something that speaks, again, of shape, size or arrangement. And, luckily for us, that is exactly what we have. Two other words, Dasapada and Astapada, refer respectively to a square board of 100 squares with 10 rows of 10 squares and to a similar board of 64 squares with 8 rows of 8 squares. Astapada, in particular, has an identical arrangement to our current Western chessboard. This, of course, didn't go unnoticed for scholars, and it is because of that Astapada is one of the main keywords when looking for the origins of chess, and often used as a synonym for Chaturanga in the context of the game. And so we have our first major clue. Some translations take the word as far as the dialogues of the Buddha in the 5th century BC. But the actual meaning of the word is established by the Indian sage Patanjali in the Mahabhasya, which is a Sanskrit treatise on grammar and linguistics written in the 2nd century BC. And it is also mentioned in the first book of the Ramayana, and even later retained by Arabic sources like the 9th century historian Hamza al-Isfahani or Hamdallah Mustafi in the 14th century. In all of these sources, Astapada is used in the context of a game or as an architectural allegory, but it is always referring to 8 rows of 8 squares. So we have our board, but we're still missing our game, and this proves to be much more complicated. Astapada was, after all, used to play many different games, usually with dice, which was the chief recreation in India. The first source to describe the actual rules of Chaturanga came by the hand of the famous 10th century Iranian scholar Abu Rayhan al-Biruni in his work India. The game described by al-Biruni was a 4-player game played with 2 dice in a 8x8 Astapada board, where each player's pieces resembled an army, and with the goal of the game being to gather as many points as possible by capturing the enemy's soldiers. After al-Biruni, further scholars like Sulapani or Raghunandana provided more detailed information about the game and its variants. All of these sources, however, have the same problem. They were written many centuries later than our first references of Chaturanga as a game. Al-Biruni, for example, wrote his book in 1031, when Chaturanga was already widely known in the East, and Raghunandana wrote in the 1500s. Since then, and particularly since the 19th century, historians have struggled to find compelling hypotheses as to how the rules and mechanics for the game may have been originally established. If we can even say that. After all, we don't even know if there was a single way to play it. The commonly found markings in the Astapada board and the fact that Chaturanga was played with Astapada has led some historians like Seward Gulling and the former World Chess champion Garry Kasparov to argue that the game must have developed from older race games that were popular in India, such as the Tagayam and other precursors of Pachisi. These were games where each player had to get a small number of pieces to a particular tile before his opponent. A race game, basically. I won't go much into detail on these games here, but they work in a similar way to Chaupat or Pachisi, the games our modern Ludo is based upon. The problem is that Chaturanga is not really a race game. As we will see in the gameplay section, its mechanics vary greatly from the games I mentioned before. The markings on the board, for instance, didn't affect the game in any way, which adds evidence to the fact that the Astapada board was used mainly for convenience. In a similar way, for example, as to how shogi came to be played in a Go board. Kasparov's argument in favor for Chaturanga's evolution from race games rests in the connection he makes between Shastriya's interpretation in chapter 5 of the Mahabharata of a dice game as a battle, and what he sees as a logical consequence of such metaphor into an actual game that represents an actual battlefield with actual warriors. A war game, so to speak. Given the context of the Indian army at the time Chaturanga was invented, Kasparov's argument is compelling. Unfortunately, given also the evidence we have, it is also far-fetched. Kasparov goes farther to use the argument of the hexagonal dice being used as a four-sides dice to strengthen his hypothesis of Chaturanga having developed from previous race games where these kind of dice were so often used. But yet again, although compelling, this connection is not necessarily accurate. Chaturanga might have been initially played with dice simply because of the fact that most board games in India were played with dice. In fact, as far as we know from the other Indian games of that period, playing Chaturanga without dice would have been the novelty, and not the other way around. Personally, what I find strong is the argument for the evolution of Chaturanga from race games is in its capture system. In antiquity, and particularly around the 7th century AC, in virtually every other board game played without dice and that involved capture, this capture was performed by what is called custodian capture or by leaping capture. We can see this, for example, in games like Peteia, the ancestor of Nefertafel, which I covered in another video that you can see around here. Games that were played with dice usually involved another kind of capture, replacement capture, which means that the capturing piece occupies the tile or the space of the captured piece. This is explained by the fact that games that were played with dice, usually race games, didn't allow the player as much versatility and freedom as games without dice did. The capture was, so to say, more direct and straightforward. Chaturanga is played like a war game, but the capture system works like that of a race game. In this regard, I agree with Kasparov in that Chaturanga inherited elements from previous race games and that it was originally played with dice. If we play chess nowadays without dice and keep playing games like backgammon or Ludo with dice, it is because Chaturanga, unlike other race games and other non-dice games for that matter, had something that was truly unique. And that I personally believe is what would ultimately make chess revolutionary. In Chaturanga, there are 5 different types of pieces, and each of them has their own specific rules and movement. But how did this come to be? The clue, again, lies in the very name of the game. Chaturanga, as we have seen, means literally having 4 limbs. But the word was also used in epic poetry to refer to the 4 parts which form the typical Indian army until the 8th century, that is, infantry, cavalry, elephants and chariots. Chaturanga is first used in this sense in the famous Indian epic Mahabharata, but there is multiple other sources that testify the structure of the Indian army, including the Ramayana and even Greek historians when describing the battles of Alexander the Great against King Porus of Punjab. However, the very first connection of the word to the game is established in the Harsha Charita, which is the biography of the Indian Emperor Harsha by the 7th century Indian prose writer and poet Banabata. In a section describing the peace and good order of the realm under King Harsha, the poet says the following: "Under this monarch, only bees quarrel in collecting dues. The only feet cut off are those in meter. Only estapadas teach the positions of Chaturanga." In other words, the author is saying that under King Harsha, fighting happened only at the game board, or so he wants us to believe anyway. If we compare the game described by Al-Biruni with this poem of Banabata, it is very tempting to conclude that the game mentioned in this fragment is the same game, if not a previous version, of the game Al-Biruni would write almost 400 years later. In other words, this game was Chaturanga, or at least a game where the military composition of the Chaturanga was identifiable. Whether the game was already known by that name, we simply don't know. But further Indian literature from two Kashmirian poets in the 9th century suggests that the pieces were at least named after the 4 divisions of the army, just like in the game of Al-Biruni, but with the actual Indian names instead of the ones in Arabic. The first reference of these two poets is the one written by Ratnakara in the Harabhijaya, also known as the Victory of Shiva, where the author alludes to the game which he simply refers to as Astapada, which we have seen it's only the game board. In one passage, the poet speaks of Fatahasha, one of Shiva's assistants, who, thanks to his skills in tactics and strategy, could repel the forces of his enemy, even though they were made up of the 4 Angas: Pati, Ashwa, Ratha, and Vipa. The passage itself is worded in a way in which it can be understood as referring both to real battle tactics and to an actual board game, with a use of double meaning that was a favorite device of the later Sanskrit poets, and that is unfortunately much better understood if read in its original language. The second reference, though, is much more interesting. It belongs to a slightly later Sanskrit poet named Rudrata, also from the 9th century, and it is a poetry book known as the Kavya Lankara. In one of its sections, Rudrata goes on to give some examples of some metrical poetry puzzles. The principle of construction for the verses is as follows. Certain syllables are placed in the various squares of a half astapada in such a way that, whether the syllables be read straight on as if there were no astapada, or be read in accordance with the moves of a particular piece, the same verse is obtained. In other words, the syllables must give the same reading, whether read as written, or read in accordance to the rules for the movement of the pieces in Chaturanga. Rudrata gives examples for the puzzles of the chariot, the elephant, and the horse, and all of them can be solved by moving the pieces the exact same way as we would do in chess today. In fact, in the case of the horse, it is a remarkable antecedent of a knight's tour problem that years later would inspire so many mathematicians, like the Swiss Leonhard Euler in the 18th century. The only piece that moves a different way is the elephant, who would correspond to the bishop in chess, but that in Rudrata's problem moves like the silver general in shogi instead. So, after all this, we can confidently say that we have the board, the pieces, and the game. We just need to know how to play. The rules I am going to explain on this video are those described by Al-Biruni and the Tidhi Tattva of Raghunandana, along with some practical insertions of Jean-Louis Cazot and Rick Knowlton. Keep in mind, however, that by the time Al-Biruni wrote these rules, neither the movement of the pieces nor Chaturanga itself was fixed, and as we will see, there are different accounts for the movement of certain pieces and their initial setup that contradict each other. This is usually an indicator that a game, although identifiable by its core structure, has its own regional variants that may change the way such game is played or even stem different games altogether. In the case of chess, this is easily seen in games like xiangqi, shogi, jangi, or even medieval Western chess as described in the Libro de los Juegos of Alfonso X. Furthermore, the game I am going to explain here is the 4-players game that has been traditionally believed to constitute the closest to the original Chaturanga. But both Murray and especially recent studies like that of Cazot and Knowlton strongly argue against the 4-players game being the oldest ancestor of chess, and believe the game was originally a 2-players game. In fact, by the time of Al-Biruni, Chaturanga or Shatrang had been played for several centuries already in both India and Persia, and even commented by previous scholars like Al-Aldi and other accounts like the ones I mentioned in the video, which is the reason why some prefer to refer to this version as a medieval variant often referred to as Chaturaji, which means the Four Kings. What I'm trying to say is that there is still a long road before scholarly consensus is established around this topic. In any case, what constitutes the essence of a game as to identify it under a certain name or category is a topic that pertains philosophy, and I will cover it in another video. But for now, and since I understand this may not be a satisfactory explanation to anyone interested in just learning how to play, we will just stick to the traditional common ground that Al-Biruni and Raghunandana's accounts provide. It is, after all, a great game indeed. I will leave all these other considerations for the end of the video, and for future videos for that matter. Although I suggest you check them out as they will provide some insight as to what exactly is what you will be playing and add some interesting facts about both Chaturanga and modern chess. So, after that babble, now yes, here it is, how to play Chaturanga. 4 players sit at the 4 corners of an astapada or chessboard and take turns throwing 2 dice. The 5 and the 6 are not considered, so if you score a 5, that counts as a 1, and if you score a 6, that counts as a 4. This is so because at the time Al-Biruni was writing this account, cubic dice were already widespread and used in North Africa, but Chaturanga was originally played with the pasa dice that were so typical in India. These dice have only 4 sides, so there was no chance to score a 6 or a 5. If you have anything resembling a square prism, I recommend you use that instead, but for this video I will just use regular cubic dice. So, each number of the dice corresponds to a move of one of the pieces. Number 1 is for either the pawn or the shah, which is the king. 2 is for the boat, which by the way was not originally a boat, but a chariot. 3 is for the horse, and 4 is for the elephant. The king and the pawns move exactly like the ones in Western chess, with the exception of the initial 2-tile step for the pawn, which cannot be done in Chaturanga. The horse moves exactly like the knight in Western chess, 1 to the 3rd square in the oblique direction. The chariot or the boat moves exactly to the 3rd square in the diagonal direction, so more or less like the bishop in chess. Due to this 3rd square rule, its movement is more limited, but it is allowed to jump over other pieces, just like the horse. And the elephant moves like the rook in Western chess, in a straight line, unless it is prevented from moving. Because Chaturanga is played with dice, the elephant is the piece that can move more tiles in one turn. One player can, for example, score 2 fours and move the elephant as much as 15 squares. Much like in modern chess, pieces in Chaturanga do also have their own value, according to which the player gets his share of the stakes, to which I will refer simply as points. Remember that in the ancient world, gambling was a core element of most board and dice games, and Chaturanga was no exception. The value of the king then is 5 points. Elephant equals to 4, horse 3, rook 2, and pawn 1. Al-Biruni goes further to say that a player can gather as much as 15 points by capturing kings alone, even if he himself doesn't have his own king. This fact proves that, unlike in modern chess, losing your king didn't necessarily mean you lost the game. He also says that if that player who has captured 3 kings is still in possession of his own king, he is awarded 54 points. This is a rule Al-Biruni says is not based on any algebraic principle, but in general consent. Aside from the value of the pieces themselves, there are other ways to gather points that you will see as I explain the other rules. Just like in modern chess, pawns are promoted if they manage to reach the last row. However, there is some special considerations. If a pawn reaches the opposite side of the board on a file corresponding to a horse or an elephant, it is promoted to a horse or an elephant. However, the promotion is forbidden if the player has 3 or 4 pawns still in play. If this is the case, the pawn that has reached the 7th position remains on its square, and only when other pawns of its side are captured may it move to the final square and be promoted. A pawn reaching the far side of the board in the boat or king file may only promote if the player has only a boat and the one pawn at most, in addition to the king still on the board. At that moment, that pawn is called a strong pawn or Gathavati, and may promote to any piece, including a vote or even an additional king. Because of their limited 2-square diagonal leap, the boats will never meet each other on the battlefield. But if all boats converge on adjoining squares, filling a perfect 2x2 square area, the last boat to arrive captures all the 3 other boats, removing them from the board. When a king enters the throne of one of the adverse players, that is, moves the king into the starting square of an opposing king, his player wins 1 point. If he captures the adverse king at the same time, he wins 2 points. I like to think of this rule as looting the enemy's castle. It's easier to understand. When a king moves onto the ally's throne, the player wins 1 point and takes control of his partner's troops. He also takes control of his ally's turn of play, so he will be having, in fact, 1 additional turn and 1 additional army, and can choose to move any of the pieces under his control in both turns. I like to think of this rule as a coup. It is also easier to understand. Of course, this rule only applies if you play a 2 versus 2 game. In a non-cooperative game, there is no allies. A player who succeeds in taking control of his ally's army and in capturing both adverse kings achieves Chaturaji, winning 1 stake. If a player captures both adverse kings with his own king, then he wins 2 stakes. If these captures were to happen on the throne, then it would be a total of 4 stakes. If a player gets a throne and a Chaturaji at the same time, only Chaturaji is counted. A captured king is a prisoner. His owner's pieces are immobilized but can be captured. His turn of play is lost and his ally fights alone against the other 2. If a player succeeds in capturing both adverse kings, but his own allied king has also been captured, he may declare an exchange of kings. In this case, the allied king and one of the enemy kings are returned to the board. They are replaced on original throne squares or on an adjacent square if the throne square is occupied. If a king is made prisoner for a second time, he is out for good and cannot return to the game. The game ends when one of the teams is completely depleted, either by retiring or by having the kings captured. At that point, the stakes or the points are counted to see which side, or which player for that matter, has won the most points according to the value of the pieces and the other special rules. Remember that this was usually played as a gambling game. Now, I mentioned before that there is some contradictions in our sources regarding the movement of the pieces. If you remember Rudrata's puzzles, the chariot moved the exact same way as the Western rook, while in Albiruni's game, this kind of movement belongs to the elephant. This may very well be the result of a regional variant that Albiruni saw in southern India, since he himself admits the chariot, which as I said is the original form of the boat, moves like the elephant of Chaturanga, that is, like a bishop. In Rudrata's puzzles, the elephant moves instead like in Situyin, CMS chess or the very silver general in Shogi, with 5 adjacent tiles available, and even Albiruni mentions this kind of movement, saying that these 5 tiles correspond to the 4 legs and the trunk of the elephant. The elephant is, indeed, the hardest piece to devise a move for, since it's the piece whose movement most frequently changes, or at least that is what an earlier reference from the 9th century of the Arabic master Al-Adli suggests. He says, an Indian was asked why they put the elephant in the corner, and replied that the commander of an army in which there are elephants must, owing to his importance, be given the place of commander of either the right or left wing. The Persians, however, think that he should be put next to the king, being required for pursuit or flight. Murray is of the opinion that the oldest move for the elephant might have been the diagonal leap, like the bishop in chess, and I agree with that. After all, they were highly esteemed as one of the most potent divisions of the army, while on the chessboard it must have soon become evident that they were the weakest of the major pieces. This is indeed a very plausible reason, although I am more of the opinion that any changes in mechanics usually are the result of attempts to balance the game or experiment with dynamic ways to play. Of course, both reasons are not necessarily mutually exclusive. In any case, it is evident that both the nomenclature and start position for the pieces with the orthogonal move and the diagonal move, so the rook and the bishop, have been interchanged multiple times. Proof of that can be seen even today in the Indian nomenclature for the chess pieces. In both North and South India, the piece with the orthogonal move is situated on the corner, while in North India the rook is called the elephant. In South India, the rook still retains the name of the chariot. I believe the chariot was indeed the piece originally situated on the corner and with the orthogonal move. This is consistent with not only Al-Adli's testimony, but also with the subsequent spread of chess in its multiple forms throughout Asia and Europe. As for the nomenclature, I definitely think the original name for this piece was indeed the chariot. Apart from the name still being used in southern India and in other Asian chess variants like Xiangqi and Shogi, it doesn't really make sense in a historical point of view for the chariot to be in the center. While in Indian ancient warfare, elephants could be used for flanking tactics, the array in which elephants were at the front, chariots at the flanks, and horses at the wings was believed to break the center of the enemy's army. In other words, elephants were most commonly used as strong lead units to break the enemy lines, while chariots felt most comfortable at the flanks. With that disposition, I also can see why Indian players might have felt that the elephant in Chaturanga wasn't living up to its name, as a rook is a more valuable piece than a bishop. Now, leaving that aside, there is, as I mentioned before, a strong argument against the somewhat traditional point of view of the 4 players game being the original one, but I will leave that for another video. In any case, I suggest you to not let these technicalities get in the way of enjoying a wonderful game. Chaturanga is very fun indeed. If you still want to explore further the historiography around this topic, don't forget to check the references in the description, and I will also cover them in another videos. And that is all for today. Now, I know this video took a long time to drop, but well, it also took a huge amount of research. The history of chess is very deep and extensive. Aside from that, I have been busy with other projects that I hope I will share with you in the future. I will try to keep future videos within a 15 minutes range, but since I will cover more chess variants in the future, I wanted to give you guys a long, strong basis of the origins of chess for when I make those videos. I also wanted to give you something long to celebrate the 100 subscribers. But while I was making this video, we almost reached the 200, so well, thank you guys for your overwhelming support. It really makes me happy to see you like this content. And to wrap it up, as always, leave a like if you learned something new, and subscribe if you want to learn more about other old games and how to play them. And if you know someone with the time or energy to listen to a 30 minutes video of random history, share the video. That would really help a lot the channel. We are very close to the 200 now. We will see each other in the next one. And until then, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.